What is your assessment?
Well, look, I think Keir Starmer is going to obviously call this a success, but we still have a long way to go until we implement the meat and bones of this trade deal. When we look towards, let's say, the EU and the US, which is probably a much bigger deal when it comes down to trade, we have to understand that there are very differing priorities in what both sides want to achieve, which is why we've seen such stalls and such unsuccessful attempts at agreeing this bilateral trade deal. The first thing is to see is that, number one, the EU want to maintain their trade surplus with the US. The US wants to decrease their trade deficit with the EU. Also, the EU is very much regulatory first, whereas the US wants market access, right? And thirdly, when it comes time to the trade negotiations, the US is much more likely to want to agree bilateral trade deals, whereas the EU want to work on WTO rules. And thirdly, when it comes down to manufacturing, both sides want to keep the manufacturing base and expand it. We see this, for example, in the EU Chips Act, where they want to double down on chip manufacturing, and the US wants to bring chip manufacturing over to the US. Yeah. So unless either side can figure out whether they're likely or happy to submit to the other side for these issues, then we won't see any progress, I think.
Okay,
substantial progress between the EU and the US.
Yeah, I just want to stop you there, Klisman, because the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, she has been talking about the upcoming negotiations. Let's listen to some of what she had to say.
Okay.
So she sounds very conciliatory there, but she also emphasized that she will look after EU interests. There was a bit of optimism there. Is it in any way justified?
Well, look, as I said before we heard that clip, I mean, what she just said is what I said as well. Yeah. They are really looking at values-based international relations. That's what the EU has been built upon. So if it doesn't match what the outcome they're looking to achieve, if they don't move at a pace that is comfortable for them, and if, number one, really most importantly, if they can't protect their own industries with any deal that they want to create, then nothing will move forward for the EU. And if you look at the consumer bases between the two countries, right, although the EU has a much bigger population than the US, they really consume perhaps almost similarly. You see what I mean? Yeah. So there is both leverage on both sides on this case. So it's not a case where the US can dictate terms to the EU and vice versa, which is why within this framework they're going to find it very difficult to actually agree anything, I think.
Klisman, there's been a warning from the Bank of England. That warning came on Wednesday, warning that the unpredictability that I talked about of US tariffs, as well as the tragic situation in Gaza, Israel's assault on Palestinians there, as well as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, puts the UK economy at risk and ultimately the global economy. How do you see it?
Well, these flashpoints that you mentioned have both regional, global, and bilateral impacts on the global economy. Naturally, tariffs and the macroeconomic environment is a big one. How central banks respond to this with interest rates will also have big ramifications on that. The biggest geopolitical issue that we faced in the past was the Russian war on Ukraine, although I think the impacts of that are felt less now as they were before. But really the meat and bones of it, productivity needs to rise, the incentives for businesses to continue to operate in specific jurisdictions need to be there. And as far as the UK is concerned, they have really been pushing, I think, the wrong buttons when it comes time to economic growth and productivity in the UK, which is why we're seeing such changes in the behaviors of consumers and also businesses as a response to this lackluster approach by the UK government.
Just very quickly, I've got about 20 seconds, Klisman. You say the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict has diminished somewhat. Why is that? Because we've just seen an escalation by Russia.
Yeah, I think because businesses and investors are pricing in this risk. So unless something dramatic happens with the war, then I think what has happened in the past had big shocks to the market, be it the oil price, be it stocks, be it trade avenues. But now this has calmed down.